Good morning. Thank you for joining us at the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago for today's program, Islamic Concepts of the Self and the Collective. My name is Kara Malenfant. I'm a member of the Society, and I'll be your moderator today. To help create a better shared understanding of who we are as a community and what we believe in, let me share a brief quote. Humanism teaches us to look for courage, for comfort, to one another, our fellow humans. We all have experienced the pleasantness of a sense of closeness with a group of strangers when we suffered some minor mishap together. For instance, the breakdown of a subway train between stops. Why cannot this satisfying sense of solidarity be called upon in all of us by the realization that humankind can expect no special dispensation from the universe? Is it not stimulating and comforting to acknowledge our dependence on one another? That's from Lloyd Moraine, who was president of the American Humanist Association in the 50s. Our programs address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, and arts, to name just a few. Today's presentation is part of our ongoing programming related to religion. Muslim chaplain Omer Mozaffar will explore the concept of the human self through the lens of belief, as well as through a secular perspective, positioning Islamic concepts in the greater conversations in our society. He will discuss ideas such as the individual's relationship with and responsibilities to the collective. Omer Mozaffar is the Muslim chaplain at Loyola University in Chicago, as well as a lecturer teaching Islamic studies at Loyola's College of Arts and Sciences. In addition, he is involved in providing care for Afghan refugee children temporarily settled in Chicago through the Interfaith Community for Detained Immigrants. At the University of Chicago's Graham School, he was given an Excellence in Teaching Award. Over the years, he has been involved in matters of counter-radicalization, as well as exposing the misconduct of preachers. He's been a consultant for Hollywood productions featuring Muslim characters, and was also handpicked by the late Roger Ebert as one of his far-flung correspondents. Join me in welcoming Omer.
Thank you for that introduction. And I also wanted to first take a moment to thank the Society for including me in your programming. And within that, I want to extend my gratitude to Dale Bennett. And within that, I want to extend my gratitude to Joe Bennett, my Ebert Fest friend, who is the person who originally pulled me in to all of this. And with that, we will jump right into my remarks. And at first, I'd like you to consider a few concentric circles. And I'll explain the first concentric circles and then the second set of concentric circles. So the first, we'll be speaking about life on the globe. And we will start from the outside and steadily move all the way to the center itself. And as we move to the center, imagine that we are moving to something that is more and more bright. And this will make more sense as we move. And then the second set of concentric circles I'll explain as well. So this first set of concentric circles will be discussing the globe, society, the individual through a general Muslim lens. At the outside, imagine a global Muslim existence, something beyond an empire. And the easiest way to understand that is that today it would be not incorrect to speak of today being a global Western existence. Now, we might call it the North over the South. We might speak of it as a global American empire with all that's good, all that's bad, and everything that's involved with it, but something that is of global influence with commonality across the globe, either found through our structure of economy or found through our educational systems all across the globe, that there's this commonality with the Western educational system. That's at the far edge. Move a little bit closer, we would have a theoretical Islamic empire. And this is where we have terms like a caliphate. And what is it that would make a caliphate a caliphate? Sometimes it's just the claim of the government, and sometimes it is the claim specifically of deriving legitimacy from Islam. There are no Muslim caliphates in the world today, although there are many that seem to be aspiring empires. But then moving in closer, something we do have very commonly in the world today, this would be a Muslim polity. And of the different types of Muslim polities, we have those that claim to be Islamic polities that are deriving not only legitimacy through Islam, but also claiming to implement Islam. So one example would be the Taliban in Afghanistan. Another would be the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Another would be the Islamic Republic of Iran. Another would be the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, so forth and so on, all implementing Islam in various ways that will find agreement with some, by some, and disagreement by some. That's one type of polity. Another type of Muslim polity would be that in which the majority population is Muslim. Religion is part of the discourse. Religion is sometimes present very much in some eras and less so in other eras. This would be like Turkey today. This would be like Indonesia today. This would be like Malaysia, where in all three of those cases, currently we have religious Muslims that are at the head. But the military sometimes veers more towards being secular. Sometimes the military is more religious. The population will have all the types of varieties of devotion as we have in any other society, any other religious population. And then there will be those that are consciously secular republics or secular monarchies. For example, Jordan, Syria. There you have Muslims or people who self-identify as Muslims at the head, but rule may have some Muslim concepts, but not as much focus on a Muslim polity. That's a simple summary of the polity level. So we have the globe, we have the empire, we have the polity. And then now, again, getting more bright, we have the community level. And this we find everywhere in the world. So this would be a Muslim community in Chicago, centered around a mosque or centered around an individual, a charismatic leader, or a network. For example, in this area, we have the Muslim Educational Center not too far from here, which is a mosque that serves a few thousand families. Also in the Chicagoland area, we have Sufi networks where you will have a teacher, a sheikh, who is at the center, and people who declare their devotion to this teacher and derive tutelage from that teacher. Or we'll have Muslim organizations. For example, a very large Muslim organization in the southwest suburbs is called the Muslim American Society. That would be one aspect of the community level, where it's Muslim communities composed of Muslims. Another aspect of the community level would be Muslims that are working with other communities, not necessarily Muslim. So these would be the interfaith conversations in where they're consciously interfaith, or they'll be focused on social causes. And so some of the work that I do with the Afghan refugees, part of it is through interfaith, part of it is through secular organizations. That would be the community level. And here what you have is person-to-person interaction. And then bringing it even smaller, we get to the level of neighborhood. So again, the globe, the empire, the polity, the community, the neighborhood. And the composition of the neighborhood will depend exactly on who is living there. So it could be one Muslim in that entire neighborhood, or it could be an entire population of Muslims. So for example, if we go to the Mosque Foundation in Bridgeview, when the mosque was first established there some nearly 40 years ago, it was a mosque built in an industrial park. Eventually, the industrial park was replaced with residential areas, and everyone moved in, meaning everyone of every sort of religious or non-religious background. And then over the course of the last few decades, more and more Muslims started buying all those homes, and it's almost like a Muslim enclave. In contrast, in my neighborhood where I live, I have Sam on one side, who is a Catholic, and then I have Jawad on another side, who is a Palestinian Muslim. And we've been living there for some 40 years. And the people who've lived there before, how other families have moved in and out. And there, the emphasis is on the relationship between the self and your neighbor. And when I'm teaching young Muslims, often the very second lesson I ask them after the very first lesson, which is about belief, the second lesson I ask them is, suppose there's a fire in your neighborhood, and down the street you have Muslims, but next to you have non-Muslims. Whom do you help first? And then I'm very happy when they give me the correct answer, which is the person who's in the most danger. So at that point, belief is irrelevant. It's a question of danger and safety. And thus, that sums up also our obligations to the neighbor. And then moving smaller than that, we have the family. And then smaller than that, we have the self. Now, if we look at this in reverse order, we have the self, the family, the neighborhood, the community, the polity, the empire, and then the globe. And again, we said that things are more and more bright as you get closer to the center. And what am I meaning there? That when you are closer to the center, the likelihood of corruption decreases because you have much more control as a self, as an individual. And the level of human-to-human interaction also increases as you get closer and closer to the center. So that's one circle. Another circle would be focused more on the scholarly tradition and the scholarly analysis of that, which we call Islam today. And so here at the outside, moving from the outside to the inside, it is all considered to be brightness. But again, as we get closer to the center, more brightness than at the edges. So at the edges of Islamic thought would be abstract Islamic sciences. For example, philosophy. Philosophy, not a place of darkness, a place of light, is abstract. And it is often the indulgence of scholars or those who are interested in abstract ideas. As well would be history. History itself is not giving us lessons, but we might derive lessons, practical lessons from there. But it is more information. It is abstract. And then as well would be theology. There is some theology which might be related to creed. Here's what you believe in if you consider yourself to be a Muslim. And then there is theological speculation, addressing questions like how do we reconcile free will and predestination? How do we reconcile suffering in the world? How do we interact with other communities at a theological level as opposed to a practical level? And today, for example, a big theological question would be how do we reconcile evolution with belief? Meaning if I fundamentally believe in evolution or don't believe in evolution, it doesn't change my practice very much. It may affect my reputation, it may affect some of my interactions, but my practical life does not get affected as much. That's the external level. And then we move closer, we have the practical Islamic sciences, which would include Islamic law. This is where we have terms like the Sharia. In addition, Islamic spirituality, which is what we speak of when we speak of the Sufis. And then we also have Islamic focus on character, manners, and justice. And so these would be practical Islamic sciences. And then moving closer, we have the reference material through which the Islamic sciences form. And this would be the Arabic language for the purpose of understanding the Quran, the central text of Islam, as well as the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him. So the Arabic, the Quran, and all that goes with it, as well as knowledge of the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him. That's the reference material. We would argue that if we were living in the time of Muhammad, that would all be practical living, but as soon as I'm living 5 years after he's passed away, now it just becomes reference material through which I interpret as instruction for how to explore my life. Now, if we look at those Islamic sciences, I spoke of 3 levels, all of that can be traced back in content, specifically as mentioned to the Prophet and the Quran. And if we page through the Quran, what do we see? We see prescriptions on how reality operates. So an easy way to think of scripture, we usually think of scripture as something prescriptive done. But if we imagine scripture as something akin to fantasy or sci-fi, but with prescriptions, that if scripture is saying, here's how reality operates, and then here is some guidance on how to navigate reality. So the Quran operates, meaning it gives very little instruction on what to do, not to do. Out of some 6,000 verses, less than 10% are instructions. Most of the Quran is focused on your thinking. And a simple example of that is the word that the Quran gives itself for a verse is ayah, A-Y-A-H, which translates as sign, and that is the same word that the Quran uses to speak of all the phenomena of the world around us and the world within us. And as an exercise, think of this, those of you who are watching either online or watching recordings, as well as a few of us here. If I give you the following scenario, think of the first thing that comes to mind without even giving it a moment of reflection. And the scenario is that suppose you're walking down a street and you see a leaf falling from a tree, the first thought that'll come to mind, especially if you're from the Midwest, is probably fall, autumn. If you're from the Southwest, where you don't have the four seasons like we do, you might be confused by the scenario. But the point here is what? That I am interpreting this leaf or the scenario of a leaf falling from a tree as a sign of fall because I'm socially conditioned to see it that way. Just by my environment that I was raised in. And the deeper point here is that I am always in an act of interpretation. I walk into a room, I'm looking at the setting, I'm looking at the people, I'm interpreting their moods, I'm interpreting what seems to be the atmosphere that might affect where I sit, that might affect how I sit, etc. We are always interpreting nonstop. And the idea then of the Quran is to shift from how I am socially conditioned to look at the world to how the Quran is prescribing me to look at the world. And the simple version of that is to look at how I'm socially conditioned to see everything as signs of whatever they are, to see everything as signs of the divine, as reminders of the divine. And so that is, in a nutshell, how the Quran operates. And then the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, are looked at as the Quran put into practice. What are the consequences of the Quran put into practice beyond the level of thinking, but in action? And so much of what we have about the Prophet, may peace be upon him, are reports of anything he's said, anything he's done, anything he's been present for, seeming to give approval without making any comments. And so we have reports and reports and reports on all of those things. And the question of authenticity we can also explore, but this is to give you a nutshell of the source material for all of these Islamic sciences. But now we can trace the Quran and the Prophet into a closer circle, a circle closer to the center, and that is the first chapter, the first surah of the Quran, which I won't elucidate over here. I encourage everyone to Google it. It'll take you longer to Google it than to actually read it. It's about 7 lines. And that is called the opening surah or the opening chapter. And that opening chapter is looked at as the flashlight through which to look at all of the outer circles. But even that has a core. Now we're getting almost to the center of our second set of concentric circles. And that is the first sentence of the Quran, which translates as in the name of God, the most merciful, the eternally merciful. The in the name of God, the most merciful, the eternally merciful. That would be the second to last of the circles. And this is looked at as a summary of the entirety of the Islamic tradition, which I'll explain when we get to the center. And the center is the first letter, the first word of that sentence, which is in or with. In Arabic, it's the letter ba, which is a preposition. In or with. And how is this read? That the center of the entire 2 circles that I've given you is the theme of connection, relationships. And so when we're speaking of this idea of Islam, it is guidance on all of your relationships. Your relationship with the self, your relationship with your neighbor, your relationship with your community, your relationship with your polity, moving further and further and further, your relationship with the cosmos, your relationship with the unseen, that all of it is an explanation, a guidance on how to inform, how to conduct your relationships. So now if we move from the inward outward, the first relationship in this Islamic paradigm is a relationship with the divine. And how does the relationship with the divine form? If we're saying that the divine is beyond sight, beyond location, beyond size, it is by the attributes and the names of the divine. So many might have heard of the idea of the 99 names of God. And what are these names? They're effectively describing God in a theoretical vacuum. More than that, they're describing God in a subjective relationship with the divine. And the first of those names or attributes is the name Allah, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, commonly translated from Arabic to English as the word God. One of the theories of the etymology of the word Allah is that it is a contraction of al-ilah. So this word ilah, I-L-A-H, is what we would commonly translate as God, lowercase g. And to give you some definitions on what does it mean to take something as a God in the Islamic paradigm would be, I'll give you 5 definitions here. One is whatever you rely upon above all else to keep you in safety, to take you out of danger, is what you take as an ilah. So imagine if I'm going camping, I'm not much of a camper, and that'll be clear when I explain this, that what would you take for purposes of safety? You'll have your tent, you'll have your blanket, you might have a knife, bug spray, you might have water, food, might keep your cell phone, might keep your money. Now imagine you're sleeping in the middle of the night and you wake up the next morning, there was a storm, you've lost everything. Then what do you rely upon? You might rely upon your instincts, your intellect, look at where the sun is in the sky, and you're walking to find some other humans or some source of relief. And let's say you realize after a while you've been walking in a circle. That hasn't helped you. Then what do you rely upon? You might shout, you might fall into despair. Here, the prescription is that you're turning to the divine. And then it is up to the divine to guide you. So what are we saying here? Whatever you rely upon above all else to take you from danger into safety. Or, number 2, to take you from despair into hope. And I'm listing these as 5, not necessarily in any order of priority, but think of them as innate human needs. Or to take you from confusion into clarity. Or to take you from discomfort into comfort. Or the most common term for what you would take as a God in this paradigm, we would translate as worship, whatever it is you worship. But if we remove the word worship and look at, again, the word that's being translated to its true meaning, because worship has lots of religious connotations, it's whatever or to whomever or to whatever you give your most extreme love. And so going back to this idea of relationships, these are all different levels of love. And these are all different levels, we'll see also in a moment, of mercy. But levels of love, think of the love that you have for your partner, the love you have for your child, the love you have for your parent, the love you have for your neighbor. And then above all else, there will be a love that you give to something or to someone. It could be yourself. It could be your child. It could be your tribe. Or it could be your nation in terms of what we would speak of when we speak of nationalism, for example. That in this paradigm, everyone gives a highest form of love to something, to someone, maybe even multiple things at the same level. And here, this is what you take as a God. And so the word Allah would then be looked at as a contraction of the God. So that's the second part of this first sentence. The first is connection, in or with. And the second is in the name of God. And then after that, we have 2 further names of God, the most in mercy and the eternal in mercy. The most in mercy, Ar-Rahman, and the eternal in mercy, Ar-Rahim. And so how is this interpreted? That the interaction that the divine has, the default interaction that the divine has, that the creator has, is one of mercy upon creation. And even then, I'm using mercy out of convenience. There's actually 2 parts to this Arabic term that I'm translating as mercy. One part is mercy itself, this word rahma. The other part is intimacy. And the idea here is that if I'm a mercy giver and I'm giving you mercy, I'm giving you ease. And then if you're recognizing that I'm giving you mercy, you're perhaps responding with gratitude. And now that develops a connection. And thus that is this intimacy. And so the first aspiration of connection for the believer, as defined by the Quran, is this connection with the divine through the lens of rahmah, which is mercy and intimacy. That I am seeing creation as an act of mercy by the divine, and then I'm responding with gratitude. And then it extends further. When we speak of the most in mercy and the eternal in mercy, commonly the most in mercy is looked at as general mercy for all. And then the eternal in mercy is often understood to mean that the divine has a unique relationship of mercy with all of creation. And so think of the first as being like rain or the sun, and the second like a mother to her child. When you have rain or the sun, when the rain is falling, it falls on everyone, regardless of belief, disbelief, regardless of being upright or corrupt. Everyone receives rain. Likewise, everyone receives sun. And thus, everyone is receiving the mercy of the divine, which then means for me as a believer within this lens, that if the divine has determined that this person is worthy of receiving mercy because they exist, because they've been given existence, then they have been given innate dignity. They've been given innate value, which then, if I am a believer in the divine, if I'm seeking to give and receive the love of the divine, then I have to recognize that as well. For stranger, for friend, for beloved, for foe. For everyone has an innate value, an innate dignity for the simple fact of their creation by the divine. And then everyone has a unique relationship of rahmah, meaning the relationship of rahmah, this mercy and intimacy that the divine has with me, is different than the divine has with you, which is different than the divine has with the next person and the next person. So now what are we also emphasizing? That on the one hand, everyone is very similar in receiving mercy from the divine, and yet everyone is wholly unique. And so it's the second element of the dignity of each person. And so that summarizes the very first sentence. So the core is connection, relationships. And then the first circle around the core is connection, relationships with the divine, and the consequences of this connection based on mercy, based on rahmah. And the rest of the entirety of the Islamic tradition is looked at as an elucidation of that content. That's literally Islam in a very simple nutshell. So then Islamic law, the word for Islamic law, Sharia, translates as the path to relief. And the idea is that the divine is providing ease, rahmah, mercy. The Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, is himself looked at as the embodiment of rahmah, of ease, literally in the text of the Quran. How? By providing guidance on how to look at the world. That becomes then the obligation and the goal of the inheritors of the Prophet, which are the scholars, which is to guide how to make life easy, how to facilitate ease. Now, the ease might include temporary difficulty in the way we think of physical fitness. The physical fitness involves diet, physical fitness involves exercise, and the exercise itself might be short-term difficulty with the understanding of long-term ease. And so that is a way to imagine the package that we call Islam. Now, at the individual level, what else is taking place? And this is now a third set of concentric circles. I'm going to drive you all crazy with these concentric circles. The first is the world. The second is the Islamic scholarly tradition. And the third one is me, the human being. And this is a very small set of circles. At the outward, we have the body. A step closer, we have the mind. And a step closer, we have the heart. And commonly in our society, and this I'm speaking at the lay level, not necessarily the level of intellectual discourse, we often speak of the body as the realm of the sensual and the appetite. We speak of the mind as the realm of the logical. We speak of the heart as the realm of emotional. In this paradigm, these are all three levels of intellect. That the body is your sensory intellect. Your mind is, in our language, your rational intellect. And the heart is your intuitive intellect. And a way to understand this is to think of smiling and laughter. At the realm of the body, for example, and I can't do this because I'll get in trouble, suppose I tickle you. Suppose I tickle someone who is ticklish, they start laughing. At the level of the mind, we would be speaking of a silly joke. And how does a silly joke operate? That usually there's some break with how reality is supposed to happen, and then that makes us laugh. And then at the level of the heart, imagine you have a baby, a chubby baby with a big diaper in a crib, and you're watching a YouTube video of the parents going to sleep and the baby escaping. And so you can't help but to smile. And so these are three different realms of being. These are three different realms of the intellect: the sensory, the sensual, the rational, and the intuitive. They each have their own emotional maps. And likewise, when we speak of illnesses, that which today in our society we call depression, part of my work is to try to identify where is it located. Is it located at the level of the body? Is it located at the level of the mind? Is it located at the level of the heart? Or that which we today call anxiety, where is it located? It might be in all three. And then it might be in the realm of physiology, for which the treatment would be a physiology matter. It might be in the realm of the spiritual body, which is a different matter, or mind, or heart. Now, how do each of these realms operate? Each of these three realms has an innate need. And the need of the body is connection, physical connection. Anything from seeing a smile or seeing a human face is considered to be a physical connection. So seeing is a physical connection. Better than that would be something like a handshake. Better than that would be something like a hug, and so forth and so on. So think of all the different levels of physical connection, all the way into physical intimacy between two people. That is the innate need of the body. The innate need of the mind is what we call curiosity. The need is knowledge. And the innate need of the heart is itself intimacy, which is what? It is a private connection, a special focus. And that can be two friends. It could be two colleagues at work. It could also be me and the path that I walk from my car to my office, this specific connection that I have. But again, notice the idea of connection again. Now, in this paradigm, the truest satisfaction for all of these comes by way of connection with the divine. Intimate connection with the divine, intellectual knowledge of the divine, and then physical connection with the divine. Physical connection with the divine does not happen in this life. That happens in the next life. Which then means what? There will always be an innate yearning that cannot be fulfilled in this world. And so the level of the heart is also looked at as the level of trying to figure out what are your innate yearnings. The core of which, again, is the need for connection. As though you are a complete individual on your own, yet you find fulfillment in a connection with another person, with family, with neighbor, with community, up and up and up and up. That these all become realms of connection. And the stronger the connection, the more healthy it is for the person. Of course, there can be those illusions of connections, which might be oppressive relationships, either from the government down to the most marginalized, or it could be a tyrannic one-to-one relationship. That's the illusion of a connection, when in fact it's actually subjugation. And we can even, if necessary, talk about those as well. So then, in terms of my obligations to the divine, to the collective, there is not an obligation for this global Islam, but that is often in the aspirations of many. There is not an obligation for an empire, but the concept of the empire, the word that I use is the caliphate. That is an obligation that's been translated in the modern era or I shouldn't even say modern, but pre-modern era, to the idea of a polity. But what is this caliphate? This is to be the deputies of God in this world. And how does that manifest beyond my inner self? In my inner self, the caliphate is me developing a relationship with the divine. At the collective level, or first me as the individual to other individuals, it is by way of upright character and compassion, rahma again. Meaning my obligation to everyone around me is upright character. And upright character is what we would all think of upright character, honesty, sometimes brutal honesty, even if it's bitter, keeping your trusts, keeping your promises. All of these are part of character. What we often think of as general morality, this would be all part of upright character, the lens of which is through rahma. So I'm seeking the rahmah, I'm experiencing, I'm receiving the rahmah of the divine, and then I'm seeking it to give others. How? By way of character. And then indulgence, generosity, would be a more direct example of mercy. But sometimes upright character is the generosity. And then my obligations to the collective are justice. And so justice in the content of the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet, may peace be upon him, as well as the Islamic scholarly sciences, seems to focus at one level on 4 arenas of life. Secondarily, which is what's more common, more popular, is the realm of crime and punishment. That's secondary. 4 arenas of life. The first arena of life is shelter and sustenance. The second is trade and travel. The third is protection from fear. And the fourth is the protection of religious devotion. So shelter and sustenance, what is this? That it is my obligation as a Muslim, primarily to my neighbor, secondarily to my community and society, to work in my capacity to make sure everyone has healthy shelter or healthy access to shelter and sustenance. And so if I'm the only only Muslim in my society, I work in my capacity. If everyone is Muslim in the society, we work in theory together to make sure everyone has this. So, trade and travel. Trade and travel go hand in hand because you need to be able to travel to earn trade. And so this would be my obligation to work in my capacity to make sure everyone in my society has fair trade. And fair trade in a simple nutshell means what? You get what you earn and you get what you pay for. That may be capitalism in an ideal form. That may be socialism in an ideal form. That may be a different economy, as well as different sets of guidelines and movement. Exceptions, of course, would be like a pandemic, and then movement is often shut down. But the idea should be that I have free ability to travel, to earn trade. And the fair trade should be that I get what I earn and I get what I pay for. Also, in matters of loan, this is where you'd have the conversations on interest. And so the majority opinion in the Muslim community is that any amount of interest is considered to be exploitation, even if it's within the what do we call it, the rate of inflation. Some of that at that level is debated, but the overwhelming majority opinion is any amount of interest is considered to be exploitation. So that's trade and travel. Safety or protection from fear. This is much more qualitative. It is, again, my obligation as a Muslim for people to feel safe. And this is because it's qualitative, it is harder to identify. So for example, I remember giving this lecture in class, and I had a student who lived in a gated community, and within the gated community had an alarm on her house, and every night, and she would lock her door when she'd go to sleep, and she still lived in fear. And there could be, of course, a whole story behind that, but the point being that locks in walls do not necessarily mean safety, the feeling of safety. But this is easier to understand by the way of the opposite, by the promotion of fear as exploitation. And this is in the realm of the influencers in a community, whether we're speaking of political leaders, celebrities, preachers, those who are preaching fear as opposed to preaching empowerment, that is looked at as exploitation. So if we're being told they hate us for our freedoms, and we're not being given empowerment on how to respond, that is looked at as exploitation. Or when politicians are saying, all right, the other side is not agreeing to our budget, and therefore the entire budget is going to fall apart, that's preaching fear. That is exploitation, as opposed to preaching empowerment. And so protection from fear. And the fourth is religious devotion, which is not unlike what we speak of when we speak of the Establishment Clause in the Constitution. Here, it is the obligation to make sure that people's religious devotions are protected. Now, what would be considered a religion? That would be varying from society to society all across the eras. Okay. So, for example, part of the conversation today would be, would the ethical humanists be considered a religious community? That would be part of the conversation. But the idea here is that people's religious devotions must be protected. And so this is the core element of justice. And another way to think about this, that if these are fulfilled, shelter and sustenance, healthy access to healthy shelter and sustenance, free travel, as well as fair trade, protection from fear, and protection of religious devotion, then the society is in general looked at as a healthy society. And if these are not in place, then society is looked at as an ill society. Which then means what? That if the society is an ill society, then those things that we speak of as crime and punishment do not apply. And some of those crimes and punishments are very, very severe, and historically the Muslim texts are famous for those. And we can, again, if we want in the Q&A, discuss those. But I'm saying the primary obligation for Muslims to the collective at the individual level is this upright character and this generosity, rahmah, and then it is justice. So bringing this to our society in these last few minutes, the fact of hunger and homelessness in our society becomes an indictment against, in my context, the Muslim community in our society. So not so much if there were only a few Muslims, but we have as many as 100 Islamic centers in our society. While the level of education of the ethical humanists is probably above just about everyone else, the average level of education, the amount of level of education, resources, wealth of the Muslim community in the Chicagoland area is so great that I truly believe we have the capability of eradicating hunger and homelessness in Chicago. Part of the reason is because the problem is not lack of food, because much of this is policy. And if this was a 20-year project that our community, my community, dedicated ourselves to alone, I believe we could eradicate hunger and homelessness in our society. And until then, it becomes an indictment against us that we are not fulfilling our obligation to justice to our society. Now, imagine if our various groups then work together, whether we're including the religious communities, whether we're including the secular communities, what have you, then the process could potentially be even faster. The changing of trade and travel to something less exploitative is more an international matter, because we have this global banking system, and then we have this thorough economy from top to bottom that would be affected. That I don't have an idea on how to address that. Protection from fear. It becomes what is often spoken of as one of the greatest of all jihads, the greatest of all struggles, which is to speak truth to power. And this is something that becomes a community obligation, but not something that most people are capable of, because you have to have a certain amount of confidence in your relationship with the divine, that whatever are the consequences of speaking truth, you can take. But that is an obligation that is on me as a teacher, as a preacher in our community, of speaking the bitter truth to power, especially in matters of perceived exploitation. And then protection of religious devotion is already happening for the most part in our society. So that is something where we can relax upon, because it's already institutionalized. And so looking at all this in these last few moments, from the outside in. So I've spoken from the subjective perspective of the believer, looking from the outside in. What else do we see here? That the non-Muslim has rights over the Muslim. That the non-Muslim has the right of character, has the right of generosity, has the right of the work of justice. So that in my paradigm as a Muslim, this is something that I will be held to account for by the divine, and a posthumous day of judgment, a day of accounting. Part of the day of accounting is that everyone who is owed anything will be paid back, any wrong that has been done. So that if someone has not received justice from me, or the efforts of justice from me, I will have to compensate them. But then moving further, speaking of the relationship with the divine, looking not from the lens that this is any sort of truth, but let's say this is all fiction, but a good philosophy and such. What else is provided, even at the level of religious devotion? And we'll finish here. That these core practices of connection with the divine, which we would call acts of worship, like the Muslim obligation for daily prayers, Muslim fasting in the month of Ramadan. What is the essential goal? The essential goal is to develop mercy by way of developing discipline. And so think of the 5 daily prayers that Muslims engage in as, we can call them 5 meditations, or more simply, 5 vacations from the world. So that in these moments of these prayers, I don't care about anything. And the metaphor of that is what a shower or a bath does for the dirt on your body. That when you engage in these 5 daily prayers, you're cleansing yourself of the stresses of the world. And then the fasting that will be coming up in a couple months of the month of Ramadan as an obligation to the divine is what? It's a period of transformation where I'm engaging in this repeated practice of very intense self-discipline so that by the end of Ramadan, I have essentially gone through a boot camp, which then should then contribute more to my mercy on others. And then we can extend that for the other acts of worship. So that, in a nutshell, is the Islamic collective and the Islamic individual. And with that, may the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Thank you again very much for your time.
Thank you so very much. That was incredibly enlightening, and I'm sure folks will have lots of questions for you. So I encourage you to think about those questions and start to enter those into the chat box. But as you're thinking of them, we'll have a brief musical interlude followed by the Q&A. So while you're listening to some music, while you're thinking of your questions, I'd encourage you to contribute at our website, and you'll see a link in the YouTube chat. It's through our generosity that we show how meaningful the Sunday morning programs are. We suggest a donation of $5. We're grateful for any amount that's comfortable to you or none. And of course, we really greatly do appreciate all the people who volunteer and sustain the society. Thank you. question comes from a listener or viewer who says it has been said that being a Muslim is easier than being a Christian. Sidebar, I've never heard that. But the question, do you agree? Can you explain this comparison?
That I don't know that I have the capacity to agree or disagree, even though I work as a Muslim among Jesuits, among Catholics. I would say that a couple, just looking from the outside in of both traditions, a couple of fundamental differences in the content of Islam versus the content of Catholicism is that there's no central Muslim authority. And thus, the obligation of the individual becomes much greater, and it is left to them in the relationship with the divine, in the relationship with the community and such. And that way it becomes more like Protestant Christianity. But I would guess in terms of the way that the obligations in Islam are elucidated, Islam seems to demand more particular things. In terms of the long term, it's harder to assess. We probably have to talk to a convert of who went from one to the other or vice versa.
Great, thanks. Someone asks, what, if anything, should I understand about the different branches of Islam through this lens of self and collective?
So what I gave was essentially common among the different branches. So everyone is familiar with the terms Sunni and Shia. There's a third branch, which is just as old, called the Ibadis, that no one's ever heard of because there's only about 1 million of them in some parts of Algeria, some parts of Oman. But what I'm sharing here is consistent. Some specific details might be different, especially in terms of interpretation of history. So, for example, I just mentioned that there's no central authority in Islam. In Shia tradition, there hasn't been any central authority since after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him. There's been a central spiritual authority, but not a worldly physical authority. Whereas in Sunni thought, it's been about 900 years, maybe even longer, since we've had a central authority. So some details like that, but conceptually, everything I've shared with you is the same.
The next question is someone who wants to know if there's a quick way for you to help me understand the role of women in your various circles.
So both conceptually and practically, it will be two very different things, but there are very few realms in Islam where there are specific gender exclusions. So everything from the government level, if we really get into the text, there's no obligation in terms of gender. There are certain interpretations of certain specific passages that the head of the polity should be a man, but you also find numerous exceptions of that. And even in terms of Muslim populations in the world today, Pakistan has had a female vice president, prime minister elected democratically. Bangladesh has had 2. Indonesia has had 1. Iran has had a female vice president. And so conceptually, not as much. The main place where you find it would be in terms of leading a co-ed prayer service. There, that seems to be the limitations of a man. Being an Islamic scholar, it's an obligation on men and women. Being a teacher is an obligation on men and women. Practically speaking, however, beyond the example I gave of the political realm, then you find a whole range of different roles of women in society, where in some cases women are choosing to remain in the home. In other cases, women are kept in the home. They're pushed to remain in the home. In other societies, men and women are equal contributors at the public realm. You find literally everything. You can justify all of these except for force through Islamic texts, is in theory, if Islam is for all times and places, it is applicable for all times and places. But on the same note, Islam in some cultures is used as a liberating force, and in other cultures it's used as a subjugating force, which is the reality of history.
And honestly, probably not so different from Christianity,
Yeah,
or many other religions.
Yeah.
So, yeah. The next one is less about your talk and more about you. Can you talk a little bit about your journey of self in becoming a chaplain and in joining Loyola?
Okay, sure. So I was born in Pakistan. We came here when I was about 2 years old. And I've been a Chicagoan ever since, a Southsider pretty much the entirety of my life, which means that when people favor the Chicago Cubs, it causes me various forms of pain. But aside from that, in terms of my own exploration, my parents were always very religious and were co-founders as well as very active in our local Muslim community in the far, far south suburbs. And I had really, really wonderful, indulgent teachers because the south suburbs, in terms of property value, were probably lower than many other regions of Chicago. Many of my teachers turned out to be college professors, including one who is a Muslim chaplain in Stateville Correctional Center. And so I was gifted with wonderful teachers. Growing up, however, a lot of people could still not answer my questions, for which I did believe that there were answers. And so I did also indulge in and engage in a lot more tutelage, training, learning, studying on the side. I also have severe reading disabilities, so that was also an obstacle, which also created more of an appetite. And my academic journey, I majored in just about everything. Like everyone of my generation, I was conditioned to be a physician, and I did very well in the sciences, but that was something I just did not see myself doing. And I also used to feel that there has to be something more to life than the process of growing up, getting a job, getting married, having kids, raising them to grow up, get a job, have kids. I used to stay up at night thinking there has to be more to this. Some books, like the autobiography of Malcolm X, answered by saying, yes, absolutely there is. And there are also obligations that are greater. And so that fed more of a desire to learn. In the process of learning with traditionally trained Islamic scholars, as well as academically, I found many answers to my questions, or many questions led to bigger questions. And so further schooling, but professionally at this time, my degree is in filmmaking, and my first job, I was the first employee of the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago, and I was hired to produce a low-budget TV show. But I couldn't sustain a life at that time, and so then I went into corporate life, where I was for a while. Then went into academics in the evening, and then eventually went and started working towards a PhD and left the corporate life. PhD never was finished, which is common for too many people, unfortunately, including myself, and engaged in further Islamic learning. And in that process, I became an adjunct and went through the whole process that an adjunct goes through, driving all over the city from job to job to job, including a job at Loyola. And at Loyola, the person who hired me herself as a Muslim professor there, she wanted me to get more involved with the Muslim students. And so I became an unofficial chaplain for them over the first few years I was there. And then they started petitioning for a Muslim chaplain. And when that position was ready, they offered it to me, and I accepted on the condition that I could still teach. And so that was 2014. And so now we're in 2022. And also, I've been active in various forms in the Muslim community ever since undergrad, so over 30 years.
So actually, this next question kind of is a nice segue from what you just asked about, or what you just explained about your filmmaking background. And so someone wants to know about your assessment of positive or accurate representations of Muslim experiences that you may have seen or be aware of from contemporary books or films. Anything we should know of and watch and read?
So, one set of readings I would suggest, tooting my own horn. I wrote for RogerEbert.com a 4-part set of articles about Muslim representation in modern Hollywood cinema. And there I say that there's a couple stereotypical forms you see over and over again. One is the exotic, which is someone from this different world. Like, think of the 1920s Rudolph Valentino movies of the Sheik. Another is the subjugator of women. This is the fascist man. Another is a variation of that is the terrorist. Another that is the vulnerable, faithful person. And this would be some of the side characters in Indiana Jones movies and Raiders of the Lost Ark and such. In terms of movie depictions of Muslims, within that, there's a lot of conversation among the Muslim community in media today on trying to determine what is a good depiction, because here Islam is a religion or a philosophy as opposed to a culture. There are Muslim cultures that are vibrant, that sometimes are depicted well, sometimes not. And then Muslim practices sometimes are depicted properly, sometimes not, like Muslims praying. Anytime there's a Muslim who's praying and screen and they're praying the wrong way, like all the Muslims in the audience will just start laughing. Instead, what I would encourage is watch, for example, films from other Muslim majority countries like Iran. And so the most famous director in the West from Iran right now, his name is Asghar Farhadi. He has a movie right now called The Hero, which is popular. He has a couple Academy Award-winning films like Separation, which is just profound, as well as The Salesman, and engage in the art of people from the Muslim world, while the art of Muslims here is also being formed. So, for example, most people don't realize John Coltrane was a Muslim, and Love Supreme. When you listen to it at the beginning, when he's saying a love supreme, it sounds like he's saying Allah Supreme, Allah Supreme. And he has a lot of Islamic references there. But,
I did not know that. Interesting. Thank you. Thank you so much.
another Kool in the Gang, the song Celebration, which we've all heard, is said to be written about the creation story in Islam of humans, where all of the angels and all the cosmos are now celebrating.
Interesting. Huh. A couple questions going back to sort of some tenets of Islam.
Sure.
Some questions there. So one person asks, Christian would place the soul at the center of your body, mind, and heart circles that describe the self, but does Islam have anything, sort of a notion of the soul?
So Islam does absolutely have a notion of the soul. In Arabic, it's called the ruh. And then in the Quran, it says, you know very little about the ruh except for what God reveals. And so it is a subject of a lot of speculation. And so if we were to put that at the center, it would still be consistent, but there is not much knowledge about what it is. Is it an animating force? And there's a lot of theological speculation, debate. Okay, how does it relate to the divine? Is it an extension of the divine? It's definitely looked at as owned by the divine. Where does the soul begin? Where does the soul end? You find all of that discussion as well. When I'm speaking of the heart, I'm speaking of things that the human in the Islamic paradigm has control over. Yeah. The heart, the mind, the body. Yeah.
So another question about sort of the central tenets of Islam. If there isn't a central authority, how is this person uses orthodoxy, but how is consonance? How are directions set? How is that maintained?
So this is a wonderful question as well. That which we call tradition would be a generations long conversation. Someone produces some sort of scholarly work, one of their contemporaries or someone 800 years later might respond. And the tradition is the conversation as well as the implicit and explicit assumptions that seem to be agreed upon and the implicit and explicit boundaries. And so over the course of the generations, later generations begin to figure out what these boundaries are and figure out what these assumptions are that are built into these texts. And thus, as a participant, you are either by virtue of how you were raised or how you've chosen to live, positioning yourself within that. So within this realm of Islam, I am a Sunni. And within Sunni thought, I tend to follow one particular school of Islamic law. And the reason I follow that particular school of Islamic law is because my teachers were teachers of that field. But that which is Sunni is very, very wide, basically including as much as 80% of the Muslim world. And then even that which we call Shia is 20%, which is still huge and as old as that which we call Sunni. And Sunni and Shia is not like Catholic and Protestant. A different analogy would be something like Methodist and Baptist. And so they're different psychologies, but on paper, it's harder to figure out the difference between the two if you're looking at a Sunni or a Shia document, unless you know exactly what to look for.
So next question, slightly related, is sort of about the differences in how people interpret or live in an Islamic faith. And this person wonders if the ways that the Taliban is preventing girls from studying, as one example, what are a variety of Muslim reactions to that kind of a choice? So
in the case of the Taliban right now, I call them Taliban 2.0. So to give you a super brief history, think of our starting point as the moment the Soviets invade Afghanistan in 1979, which also happens to be, coincidentally or not, the same time that the Iranian Revolution is taking place next door. But the Soviets invade, and then we get involved to push them back, and we involve a number of countries, Pakistan next door, Saudi Arabia. We even involve Israel. We involve a number of nations too, as part of our time in the Cold War, to push back the Soviets. And so we were arming the Afghans and inviting people from across the world to fight in a religious war called the Holy War. We call those people Mujahideen. Those of us who are old will remember that, old enough will remember that. And even Rambo 3 is dedicated to the Mujahideen. Mujahideen literally means the people who do jihad. And then when the Soviets left, everybody left. And so you have this nation full of weapons, and it becomes a 6-way civil war. And so whatever wasn't destroyed under the Soviet occupation then gets destroyed in this civil war. Now, what adds to the complications is that we used to publish the children's books. You had all these children that are becoming orphans that were then being raised in orphanages that were commonly seminaries as well. And you would be startled by what these children's books would look like. So if I were to go to a bookstore here and buy a book to teach a child how to count, you'd have the number 1, and here's an apple. Number 2, here's 2 bananas. Number 3, here's 3 pencils. In these books that we were publishing, you'd have guns, you'd have knives, you'd have bodies. And I didn't believe this until a friend of mine who used to work for CNN said he himself saw it there. And so you have this generation of orphans being raised this way in seminaries, and a few of them are watching this civil war taking place in their land and decide they have to do something about it. And the word for student is Taliban. And so these were seminary students who, in a very short period of time, took over the entire country. And from their lens, it's because they had God on their side. But if you look at the geopolitical forces, you have Pakistan, who is also supporting them, their secret service and such. They take over the country. And so now you have seminary students running a country. It would be like biology majors conducting major surgery. Okay? And that was even if they were conservative, liberal, what have you. And so their approach was to be ultra strict, which is what their reputation was. Taliban 2.0 has become much more savvy, at least in terms of perception. But there is a hope that there will also be much more, what in our language would be conscious, compassionate, and such. And so there's a lot of skepticism that they will be the same as their predecessors, but also a lot of hope that they will be a more sophisticated governing body. But we'll wait and see. But I mean, I sit with these orphan girls and such who have very unhappy stories to tell.
And another question was, can you tell us a little more about the current situation with Afghan refugees, either from your own personal experience with these girls or just your general knowledge of how things are going? I know I have friends who are sponsoring Afghan families. They're still arriving.
Beautiful that they're doing that. I really appreciate that. And so we've all seen the footage of Afghans trying to escape and into U.S. military aircraft. They were brought to the United States, and then, for lack of a better term, and it's probably an appropriate term, parceled around throughout the entire country. And so in Chicago, a few months ago, we had about 90 kids, ages 14 to 17, who were in various detention centers here in Chicago. I was pulled in because I have relationships with some of the organizations that were involved prior to COVID with others, for example, kids who are survivors of sex trafficking. And so me and a number of volunteers, we go a number of times a week. That's where I'll be going after this meeting, and spend time with the kids. I focus on religious tutelage. And this is different than many cases because the kids are also a American foreign policy matter. And so you have to get not just background checks from DCFS, but also from the FBI and such. And these kids have been sitting in these detention centers for 5 months. Most of these detention centers are capable of holding kids for about 3 weeks. And because it's a foreign policy matter, they're not allowed to leave. And so they're sitting there in their sweatpants and shirts and just begging for an hour of time outside. And then you listen to their stories, and their stories are horrific. And I'm just speaking about the travel from Afghanistan to here. One girl was telling me last week that, she wore the same clothes sitting in a camp in Wisconsin for 30 days. And think of all the other needs that a young woman has over the course of a month, for which she was given nothing. And so her clothes are bloody. And she's hinting at assault experiences by whom? Who knows? U.S. military, Afghanis, who knows? She didn't want to share. And all of these girls have these stories. And it's reached a point where every week I'm hearing of one of these kids attempting to take their lives. It's ridiculous. It's horrific. And Afghanistan itself, in terms of what we and other countries have done with it for the last 40 plus years, is a shame. It's a global, it's an embarrassment of history. And what we're doing right now with these kids and these families is still positive, but it's a very clunky process. And apparently 400 to 1,400 families will be coming into Illinois in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah.
So the need is going to be off the charts.
Wow. Yeah. So that just really reminds me of where you ended, where you're talking about self and sustenance, right? Which sounds like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like we've got to take care of the very basics. Those things have to be homelessness, food and insecurity, all those kinds of issues. A person asked, and I kind of had the same question. The fact that there are more Muslim people becoming active in politics in the United States, right, at the state level, at the federal level, I don't know what the question is. What do you make of that? Do you think it will change the political trajectory? Do you think that sort of Islamic sense of self and these very basic obligations will translate into changing policy?
So yes and no. And the easiest way to assess that is by looking at other communities, Jewish community, Catholic community, for example, that are also coming with very strong ethical doctrines and such. And it's the nature of politics and power. Well, you will have those people who will use this to elevate themselves. You will have those people who will be driven by these principles and use that as their platform. As a community, we have not yet developed a sort of Muslim platform. So right now, the closest thing to a Muslim platform is a general alliance with those who are more left of center. But we also have a lot of Muslims that are very right of center in their politics, as we would expect. And so those discussions haven't taken place. There are a few people in Chicago, including relatives of mine, but a lot of friends of mine that are very, very active in trying to organize Muslims and such and trying to develop whatever this Muslim platform would be. And so I'm hopeful, but the default that we're prescribed is that if you're speaking of a regular person, a lay person, you should give them 70 sympathies before you give them any skepticism. Power, it's sort of the inverse, and give them 70 skepticisms before you give them any sympathies. So let's wait and see. According to many people, we've already had a Muslim president right before Donald Trump. So, but that's a different point.
Oy, oy, oy. Yeah. Let me scan through these questions and see what else we've got.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer anything.
Oh yeah, what does the Muslim community look like at Loyola in terms of the size, activities? Is there a mosque? Can you tell us a little bit about that chaplain role and what the student population's like?
Absolutely. So having adjuncted all over Chicago, I'll say that what I did not expect was that the Catholic institutions seem to be the most welcoming of Muslims and Islam in my anecdotal experience. And in Loyola in particular, there is a dedicated Muslim prayer space, which also includes space for Muslims to perform their wudu, their ablutions as well. And the Muslim population is give or take about 500, mostly undergrads, a few grad students, a few faculty members. It used to be upwards of 700 to 800, but with financial aid changes across the state of Illinois, we've lost a lot of students. In terms of socioeconomics, you have everything, every socioeconomic level. In terms of ethnicity, the big clumps are South Asian ancestry students as well as Arab ancestry students, small but significant population of Eastern Europeans like Bosnians and Albanians, small but significant population of Nigerians, small but significant populations of African Americans. But the big clumps are Arabs and South Asians, which also, what I just described also represents Islam in Chicago. There's one of my students from outside Loyola. And then the school itself has been receptive to my needs, requests for the Muslims. So we're having discussions right now on how to accommodate for Ramadan, which will be beginning in April. So you have daily fast breaking, and then Eid celebrations, a celebration at the end during finals. And so we have to figure out how to accommodate for the students in that way.
So actually that leads to the closing question I wanted to ask you, which is either from your own personal experience as an immigrant or working with students who are immigrants, how is the practice of Islamic faith changing as people come from wherever they're coming from and whatever traditional practices they were able to uphold to the US, into this environment?
So one of the wonderful things when we speak about the United States, either as a melting pot or a salad bowl or what have you, is you have a huge diversity of Muslims from all the different cultures all across the globe. What we find is the acts of worship tend to have very, very little variance. So if I do Friday prayers in Chicago, it'll be more or less the same as Friday prayers all across the world. The difference might be how much non-Arabic is being used. That's the acts of worship. Clothing, gender dynamics will vary everywhere. Power dynamics will also vary, and that includes who's recognized by a layperson as a scholar. So, I mean, I dress on campus exactly the way I'm dressed here: jeans, coat, shirt. I would be received very differently if I dressed in, for example, Arab robes or South Asian clothing. And for some, that will be a sign that I'm a foreigner. For some Muslims, that'll be a sign I'm a foreigner, and for other Muslims, it'll be a sign of authenticity. And so just imagine all the different variations. We have those in Loyola in particular and Chicago as well. So if we go to Devon Avenue, where we have a large population of recently arrived Muslims and Hindus from South Asia, there the approach to Islam tends to be much more on the conservative side. If we go to the suburbs, we'll have people who are a bit more integrated into society, perhaps even by a generation or two or three, and there we'll have much more of a sense of assimilation. Then we have a very large contingent of African Americans and a very large growing contingent of Latinx Muslims. And a lot of Islam in Chicago is a legacy of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, as well as other groups that people are not as familiar with. And so there's much more of a sense of already being an indigenous American. And then how do you fit within the greater Muslim population? So it's a really, really wonderful mix of anything and everything.
Well, thank you so very much for coming and speaking with us today. I really appreciate it. In just a second, I'm going to be reading some announcements, but virtually join me in applause, people.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be here. I really appreciate it. And I'm happy to continue the conversation with anyone. You can find me easily online. Just look up Muslim Chapel in Chicago.
Great. Thanks so much. Related to today's topic, and I found one from Desmond Tutu, who was writing about indigenous African recognition of interdependence called Ubuntu, which folks might have heard of, but I liked his definition. It is the essence of being human. It speaks of the fact that my humanity is caught up and inextricably bound in yours. Ubuntu has to do with the very essence of what it means to be human, to know that you are bound up with others in the bundle of life. In our fragile and crowded world, we can survive only together. We can be truly free, ultimately, only together. We can be human, only together. Thank you.